It is great to have back with us today Rob Larson, who's a professor of economics and also author of the book Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley. Rob, great to have you on.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
So, when I was on the Joe Rogan program a few months ago, we had this exchange where he started talking about how, of course, a company like Google is a liberal company. And it was an interesting conversation because it seemed that what he was talking about was, does Google have a policy about anti-trans bullying and that type of thing? And I pointed out, listen, Google is a company that is advocating for less regulation, is advocating for, at a financial level, against some of the antitrust interests that the people may have and may want to have exercised through their government. And so if they, have an internal policy where you can't misgender people, that's not really making them a liberal company when you consider the sort of broader circumstances of where they are in the world of regulation and not paying taxes and so on and so forth. What is the right way that we should sort of think about the political orientation of these big tech companies that often have a sort of progressive-ish seeming public side, but behind the scenes are really very similar to, an oil company or whatever else the case may be?
Yeah, right on. Well, that's, very true. These companies definitely do affect a very, woke, very pro-diversity sort of public posture. But to me, I think, based on my research, the right way to sort of frame this issue is to look at it from the point of view of what the company wants and then what the workforce wants. And if you sort of dig into it, a lot of the time when people talk about how these companies are liberal and they're so on the left, it sounds goofy because these are, after all, publicly traded corporations whose stock is held by the wealthier households of our society and big financial institutions. How could they be leftist and anti-capitalist? I think a lot of the confusion is people look at what, the workforce is saying and then impute that to the company. Well, the company must be liberal then. But of course, as we've seen just in the last several months, we've had a couple of fairly significant labor actions against Google where the workforce, various components of its enormous workforce, are doing walkouts and going on small strikes and doing independent organizing. And just lately, I think maybe the ultimate rebuttal to claims these companies are liberal is just lately Google has been retaining the same classic union busting, anti-labor organization law firms that Walmart and Microsoft have been hiring for years, and especially too, when you look at the interface with public policy in the face of all these new investigations that big tech, including Google, are subject to, what they call the techlash, so the congressional investigations, the FTC and Justice Department probes, and the state attorneys general as well. Google is now one of the biggest lobbying firms in Washington, spending many million a year, more than all of its tech peers, more than Amazon even, on lobbying the government. And of course, they play a big role in election financing, both directly and through their PACs. So to me, what I would just suggest to folks like Mr. Rogan is it's really worth taking a small amount of time to differentiate between what the labor force is pushing for and what the company wants. And then, yes, policies that are, say, for example, diversity oriented for a richer representative staff, as in protecting the rights of trans workers, versus the real money aspect of the equation, which the firms are most interested in, all the lobbying and maintenance of their monopoly. And Google got the FTC to just stop investigating it during the Obama years. That's where these bodies are buried.
One of the big differences between tech companies and a lot of other companies is that there's often some kind of almost like a fairy tale, a romanticized story about the origins of the company. Mark Zuckerberg invented it in his Harvard dorm room, invented Facebook. Jeff Bezos was in some job he hated and, had the idea to start Amazon and whatever else. You don't see that with a lot of other types of companies that many of us interact with regularly, whether they be car companies, airline companies, or whatever the case may be. I'm curious whether part of that is because a lot of those other companies have just been around much longer, so the story of their creation seems less relevant because it's further away, or is there something more? Has there been a concerted effort to keep the mystique through these sort of fairy tale origin stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, pretty much those are the two dynamics. If you look at all of our great blue chip Fortune 500 companies, including your classic old company giants, like GM and so on, or Ford, uh, IBM. They all have this very folksy, yes, small business. I developed this company in my mom's basement in the Depression sort of origin mystique. It's true. These companies are all much younger, of course. Several of them are only 10, 20 years old. So their origin story is more recent and therefore more foregrounded. But also, just because of the information-based nature of these products, there's a little bit more of but how did you get the great idea for this company? Because since they're information-based, the idea for their platforms and for their services is kind of more of the core of the whole business than it is if you're manufacturing light bulbs and stuff. So it's true, like there really is that small business started in a garage mystique. But of course, as I look at in one of the chapters of the book, the firms vary, of course, but very typically their origins in terms of their technology comes straight from the public sector. So Google, again, is a classic case. People talk about, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. They had the idea to start the firm, and it's this great idea, and they've built all these great businesses since. I just want to remind people Google's original web address wasn't google.com. It was google.stanford.edu because they developed that at Stanford research labs in their computer science program, one of the great publicly funded research university campuses in the United States, where you've got stable funding and you are allowed to indulge your intellectual curiosity and think freely about what would make a good search engine or what would make a good social networking system. In the marketplace, you're under near-term pressure for profitability to get your stock price up and keep Wall Street happy with you. In the academic world, you're free to take your time. And of course, the internet itself, after all, was originally developed by DARPA, the Pentagon's research arm, along with the university system. And in the book, I just go through Amazon, Facebook, Google, and the internet, and the hardware itself, like the stuff in your smartphone. Almost all of that technology comes from one or another public sector research institution, or at least through heavy public funding, which again insulates you from that short-term market pressure. So to me, the story of the origins of these firms is one of the juiciest phony aspects about them.
Well, so to stick with that a little bit, can you talk a little bit about what sort of regulatory or financial incentives also existed that allowed these companies to do what they did and to grow as quickly as they did? I mean, certainly at a base level, people increasingly dependent on the internet and more of day-to-day society being run through the internet is a huge boon to a company that exists on mobile phones and on the internet for sure. But in terms of regulation, tax breaks, et cetera, what else was done that allowed these companies to grow so quickly at the start?
For sure. Well, the very loose regulatory framework is an important part of this story. All through the era when the internet and internet-based services were becoming more popularized, like I'm old enough to remember in the 90s when the internet came to town and you could go to some library campuses and look up other card catalogs. At that time, it was a bipartisan view that what you don't want to do is regulate the internet or online industries because that's going to impose new costs on them or limit their innovation and their creativity. And for the longest time, like well through the Bush years into the Obama years, that was something that was more or less bipartisan. We don't want to regulate the net. It's growing. It's giving us all these fun free services and so on. Now, of course, as these firms have become so important, and as you say, as we're so reliant on them, and we start seeing their power in elections, in our society, in the way that we deal with everything through our phones, people are a lot more interested in putting some leashes on their behavior and on their power. But to me, the real issue with having had such a loose regulatory framework for so long for big tech is what I talk about in the first chapter of the book. These are markets that are subject to what we call network effects in economics. And network effect is just something that applies to certain markets where an information-based product is at play. And the big thing there is that with those sort of markets, the service gains value the more people use it. So like a telephone, as more people get on the phone network, your telephone gets a little bit more valuable to you because there's more and more people you can potentially call. Well, the same network effects apply to companies like Facebook. You want to be on the network that has all your friends on it, not on the one that has no one on it. And Google search, even as more people do Google searches day in and day out, their algorithms keep learning from that. And the more searches that are done, the stronger their algorithm and search processes become. So the thing about network effects is they're a strong incentive that leads to monopolization or maybe having two or three very dominant firms in a market. And that is what we see in big tech, from Facebook's and Instagram's, oligopoly to, Google's mobile search monopoly to YouTube. There's a long list, but it's all these straight economic aspects to it.
So there was a big deal made when Amazon, basically after being shamed by Bernie Sanders, decided that they were going to start paying everybody 15 bucks an hour. And the end result I thought was great. Of course, it was a calculation for Amazon that there was going to be a PR benefit, more than likely, that in the long term would exceed the additional cost to them of paying the 15 bucks an hour. But let's ignore that for a second. Let's imagine that it worked, in that an elected official shamed a company and they made the right decision. When Donald Trump, between being elected and inaugurated, went to, I believe it was Indiana, and announced that he struck a deal with Carrier Air Conditioner that they were going to keep their factory open in Indiana. And what he basically did was just give them money, right? There was a plan where Carrier decided we're leaving, and Trump came in and said, hey, here's some money if you stay. My criticism at the time was, this is not a scalable economic policy. This is saying, hey, I found a company that has already made a business decision. I'm changing the calculus by giving them some cash. And of course, in the end, that money was used to start automating away those jobs. Anyway, half of the workforce still went to Mexico. It was a disaster. There's not that much of a difference, in a sense, between Trump giving money to Carrier to get them to stay and Bernie pressuring one company to pay 15 bucks an hour. Now, of course, the one that Bernie did is working out much better in terms of its results. But my question is about the scalability of policy when it comes to these things. We can't really be relying on elected officials to be making one-off deals, can we? I mean, it seems to me that we need something systemic to be done about regulation, incentives, job creation, whatever the case may be.
Oh, absolutely. And I think even like across, the wide spectrum of opinions about big tech, I think that is sort of recognized. So again, whether you're suspicious of big tech from a more left or a more conservative point of view, I think broadly it's recognized what you need, is a set of stable rules that are uniform from one company to another, and stable across time. You can't just be piecemeal threatening or throwing cash at these firms. But again, what it sort of comes back to, though, is the power of these firms. Like, most companies couldn't get all of America's cities to debase themselves and beg for a second headquarters, but Amazon absolutely was able to do that, and it was quite a spectacle. And they ended up splitting the investment and walking away from New York, and then, of course, putting tens of thousands of jobs there anyway without millions of dollars in cash, which kind of shows perhaps the lack of necessity for these huge subsidy and incentive packages. But hopefully, with these new investigations we have coming down at the national level, and indeed the international level, of these big tech firms, we do have the FTC and the Justice Department here, and overseas, like, the strongest regulation so far that any of these firms are subject to is all emanating from the European Union, from privacy to data storage to the right to be forgotten. It's interesting, and of course I talk about it in the book a bit, because the difference in these regulatory conditions. Plus, it does end up mattering that all of these big tech platform companies and their monopolies or semi-monopolies, they are all American. And the European Union is used to being partially dominated by American firms, from IBM to Coke. But they're a little more willing to regulate firms that are out of state, despite a real political presence that those firms have overseas too. But I think a new rules-based approach is very reasonable, especially one that limits the power of these firms. Again, we have a fairly long record now of all of these firms. Once network effects builds up their market power, from Microsoft all the way to Google and Facebook, they aren't shy about using it to crush competitors and destroy rivals. I mentioned this in the book. There's just a piece of Wall Street Journal reporting about Facebook, and they didn't seem to be using this word ironically, but they mentioned that Facebook has a whole little division in the company whose job is to monitor startups, new small web-based firms that might potentially compete with Facebook or one of its other apps like Instagram or Messenger. And they try to buy up that firm at a very early stage when they can buy it for just $1 million from some founder in their garage, or crush it or go after it legally in some other way. And the way the journal described it was, Facebook is out to disrupt any potential challengers, which is kind of funny because, of course, all these firms talk about is how we're disruptors and we're breaking up that inefficient old economy. Now that they're the economy and the five biggest companies in the US are all these tech platforms now, which is unheard of, they try to disrupt and put control over their upstarts and small competitors too. So I think rules that rein in these firms' power, or even go further and putting the workforce more in charge, or and in that way potentially partially socializing the platforms. To me, those are the things we should look at. Things that address the firm's market power.
No question about that. We've been speaking with Rob Larson, who's a professor of economics. The book is called Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley. We are linking to the book. Definitely check it out. Rob, always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Dave. My pleasure.